Greetings and very welcome back to my humble neck of the YouTube woods. Hope everyone's well. And speaking of which I'm a little bit under the weather, so forgive me in advance if there's a sniffle or the voice is a little rougher than usual. But we are gathered here today in honor of my good buddy, my good vegan gaming footballing legend buddy, Gull Payne, who has issued how do you phrase it? A call to contributors for a little Samhain Resident Evil project he has in mind, which is essentially a ranking of 16 Resident Evil titles, the core titles across the long spanning series. And anybody is welcome to contribute. I think he's leaving it up for maybe a month or a couple of weeks. So basically, the 16 titles, you rank your number 1 as your favourite and number 16 as your least favourite. So of course, the fact that Gull requested this and the fact that it's Resident Evil, even in my wounded state, we decided to swiftly try and dig out the Resident Evil games and rank from 1 to 16. And I found it was more difficult than I anticipated. I did do a top 5 Resident Evil video 2 years ago in and around Samhain, actually. It's the only top 5 I've ever done. It's not something we'd regularly do or think of doing on the channel, even though I do like when other gamers do top 5s and top 10s and so on. And I'm going to stay true to that top 5. So if you do have any deja vu and you have a good memory, the top 5 have pretty much stayed the same. And I just want to emphasize that we're not going to go into detail on the games because it's 16 titles that I'm really quite fond of and we could be here all night type thing, you know? The other thing is that I like every single one of them. I felt really bad when titles couldn't get into the top 10 or didn't quite make the top 10. And to be fair, I'm so fond of the series that at any given moment there will be swings and roundabouts and fluctuations in the various rankings. But nonetheless, we shall dive into it, shall we? Probably controversial, even though it's so subjective as usual, but number 16 I'm going to go for is Resident Evil 4, the original, on the GameCube. I mean, this has to be in most people's top 5, I'd imagine, but that's the beauty of it. Yeah, for me, it was just a step too far back then, a little bit too different than the classic games that I enjoyed, and a little bit too goofy, with Leon's quips and humor, and the puzzles were kind of dumbed down and whatnot. Now, I appreciate it a lot more nowadays, and I do really enjoy it, but nonetheless, that's my number 16. Number 15 is Resident Evil 3 Remake, which, I don't think it deserved all the flack that it got, to be honest with you. I did enjoy it. I got the platinum on it. There were certain things that didn't resonate with me. I thought Brad's death in the original was far better. I didn't really appreciate Jill's attitude, treating Nemesis like an unwanted boyfriend or a hindrance or an annoyance rather than a genuine enemy. But yeah, a genuine threat rather. Because in the original he was so foreboding and, menacing. So Resident Evil 3 Remake, still enjoyed it. That's number 15. Number 14, Resident Evil 2 Remake, which I know an awful lot of people really adored. I did too, to be fair. It's great overall. There was a few things, like I mentioned in the other video, that I preferred from the original. But yeah, that's Resident Evil 2. Next up, Resident Evil 8, Resident Evil Village. I enjoyed this too. Don't get me wrong. it kind of was close to the being, entering the supernatural realm on occasion. A little bit too much for my liking. But no, overall, I enjoyed it. That's Resident Evil 8. Next up, Resident Evil Revelations. I first played this on the 3DS and then later again on the PlayStation 3. It was good. It had a bit of a kind of backstory to the BSAA and fleshed out a few of the founding members and characters, and the chapter system was quite interesting. I didn't really resonate with the two comic relief characters, Keith and someone else. But for the most part, good game. Next up, we have Resident Evil 4. Now, this is representing the Resident Evil 4 remake, but this is actually the original on PlayStation 4. I do have the remake, and did I put a video up? I did. I put one video up on the channel of the remake, which was basically the only time in the entire game where Leon is actually kind to an animal. The majestic Modra, who has his leg trapped. So he sets the dog free, and then the dog comes back to help him against his first encounter with El Gigante. Nice wholesome moment. But the remake is being lent out to one of my nephews at the moment, so this is a placeholder for the remake. I did prefer the remake over the original. It was just a lot of fun to play. It almost felt like Metal Gear Solid. Leon sneaking around and taking out the Ganados tactically and whatnot. And I think most of the characters are better done in the remake. Maybe with the exception of Sadler, because I felt in the remake Sadler really did buy into the whole Los Illuminados cult. Whereas in the original I got the impression that he was just using that as an extra form of manipulation to gather power and so on, Next up, we have Resident Evil 6, kind of metal case, the only metal case I have in my little collection. This obviously got a lot of flack back in the day. I have very fond memories of it because I basically played through like 3 of the 4 massive campaigns with my nephew, Patrick, in the space of 2 or 3 days. I think he stayed over and we just got stuck into it, So very fond memories in that regard. I think it was actually a really ambitious game, this. I loved seeing Sherry and Jake, and their kind of relationship. Sherry Birkin especially, obviously, with her roots in Resident Evil 2. And I did like that the story was actually quite dark and sinister and grim, but you had to shoot an awful lot of silly things around the map in order to unlock the foils, and then you read the foils, which gave you a little bit more backstory and a little bit more nuance. So I didn't think that was a great choice, But yeah, Resident Evil 6. I'll leave the rankings in the description at the end of the video, Gull. Hopefully, I'll remember. Next up, speaking of good co-op, Resident Evil 5. Another one that was very controversial. I mean, it's really popular. I think it's like the best-selling Resident Evil game of all time to this day. So it's very popular in that regard, but was very divisive amongst the community for being a bit too action-heavy. Ah yes, the fall of Wesker, eh? So, Resident Evil 5. Next up, we have the original Resident Evil 3 on the PlayStation 1. You can see I will be, I gravitate towards the old school tank controls, fixed camera, nostalgia era, I have lots of friends who are really crazy about 3. They prefer it over the original and number 2. Not so much for me. It was a bit too action heavy, where you got to your box and you were just armed to the teeth, and it was just, it felt a wee bit short. But still, great game, don't get me wrong. Next up, we have Resident Evil 0, which Gull really likes, I believe. I think he might even have this as number 1. Beautiful looking game, very much in the same time frame as the Resident Evil remake, so it's gorgeous in that regard on the GameCube. They tried a few things differently. You were able to switch between Billy Cohen and Rebecca Chambers, Billy being more tough and resilient, Rebecca being able to heal and solve various puzzles and whatnot. They even got rid of the box system, the iconic box system, and you were just able to drop items on the floor in any given room. So kudos for being brave and attempting to try a few different things. So Resident Evil 0, quite high on the list. And then we have the original Resident Evil on the PS1. The second Resident Evil I ever personally played. Played Resident Evil 2 first and then seeked this out and absolutely loved it. And there's very little between Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 1 for me in terms of ranking. We are entering the top 5, so we're getting there, guys. Be patient. We have Resident Evil Revelations 2. Get deja vu. This is a strange one, I think. I can't see this being rated highly for most of the Resident Evil fans that I know. But I really enjoyed this. You know, the return of Barry Burton and the return of Claire Redfield after so long. And the interesting mechanic with Natalia and Moira. Alex Wesker I thought was a really interesting character as well. And the whole consciousness swapping concept was very interesting as well. And it is quite dark and gloomy and Kafka-esque. All about fear and so on, you know. So yeah, Resident Evil Revelations 2. Number 4, Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil Biohazard. This just caught me at the right time. I was quite apprehensive about it, to be honest with you. A first person Resident Evil style game that didn't have any of the classic characters. It was obviously the introduction of Ethan Winters and Mia Winters and so on. So I went in very skeptical and my expectations were quite low. And what I found is that I just had an absolute blast with it from start to finish, you know, and it was creepy and atmospheric, and there was so many throwbacks and nods to the old school games. Certainly for the first half of the game, it gets more actiony the further you get in, you know. But yeah, I think it's worthy of the top number 4 in my list. Next up, we have the first Resident Evil game I ever played, Resident Evil 2 on the PlayStation 1. Absolute classic, of course. The introduction of Leon and Claire and Sherry, and just a brilliant game. Classic. Number 2 is, of course, the Resident Evil remake on the GameCube. Absolutely love the original Resident Evil conceptually, and this just did all of that and looked gorgeous and added to it and did it better. So yeah, and it's such a good game to go back to. It's the one of all the Resident Evils, it's the easiest one for me to go back to and actually play every couple of years and just appreciate it more and more. So number 2, Resident Evil remake on the GameCube. And anyone who knows me isn't going to be overly surprised at this, but I do think it's a rarity as somebody's number 1, and that is Resident Evil Code Veronica X in this case. It's always so cool that the reflection of the zombie in Claire's eye when you zoom in. Such a cool little feature. Yeah, I adore this game. It's my favourite by a good stretch. You know, nostalgia plays a massive factor. And it's obviously the last kind of title with the fixed camera or the semi-fixed camera era. And yeah, you know, the Redfields being reunited and Wesker's unexpected return. The Ashfords are great villains. It's an interesting kind of story overall with lots of twists and turns and whatnot. So yeah, Resident Evil Code Veronica X is my number 1. So please feel free, guys, to get involved and rank the games, because it will help your personal favourite title boost up the ranks most likely when Gull finally adds them all up and tallies them all up and does all of his complex calculations. And yeah, I think that's it. I'm going to go off and have a bit of a lemsip and rest and recover before the week kicks in. I shall love yous and leave yous. Look after yourselves and each other. Be kind to all kinds and stay safe. Slán a bhaile.